Leah froze on the threshold, as if turned into a pillar of salt. Her father's words, quiet and hard as the stones that might soon be cast at her, struck harder than any slap. "You are no longer my daughter." The air in the small, dimly lit room grew thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of a cooling dinner and indelible disgrace. Her mother, Rachel, stood frozen by the hearth, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking silently. She wasn't crying. She was dying inside, and Leah knew it. Joseph, her father, stood with his back to her, gazing out the small window at the gathering dusk. His silhouette was tense, unyielding. He was an elder, a man whose word was respected in their small Galilean village. His righteousness was as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands from years of labor in the olive grove. And now that righteousness demanded a sacrifice. His own daughter. "You have shamed our family," he continued in a level voice, without turning around. "You have broken the law of Moses. You have brought sin into my house. According to the law, you deserve death." Death. The word sounded so ordinary, yet it sent a chill through Leah's chest. She knew the law. Every girl did. But it was one thing to hear it in the synagogue from the lips of a rabbi, and quite another for it to become a sentence handed down by your own father. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "Father," she whispered, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? Deny it? Her body had already begun to betray her, its rounding shape an irrefutable witness against her. Plead for mercy? There was no room for mercy in her father's eyes, only crushed pride and icy rage. He finally turned. His face, usually stern but familiar, dear, was now a stranger's, a mask carved from stone. A cold fire burned in his dark eyes. "Who is he?" Joseph asked, and there was no curiosity in the question, only the need to know the name of the one who shared this mortal sin with her. Leah remained silent, her head bowed. She couldn't say his name. Nathan, a spice merchant from a distant caravan that had stopped in their village in the spring. His smile had been as warm as the midday sun, and his stories of faraway cities, Jerusalem, Damascus, Alexandria, had made her head spin. He told her she was as beautiful as a pomegranate blossom. He promised to return in the autumn to ask for her hand. She had believed him. She had given him the only thing she had, her honor. And now autumn had nearly arrived, but Nathan was not here. There was only the shame growing inside her. If she spoke his name, they would find him. Death awaited him too, and though he had betrayed her, she could not be his executioner. "I will not say," she whispered. Joseph took a step toward her, and Leah flinched instinctively. He raised his hand, and she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow. But the blow never came. He lowered his arm, and his voice was even quieter, even more terrifying. "You are dead to me. Gather your things. By dawn, your spirit must be gone from this village. If any of the elders see you, I will not be able to stop them. Go wherever you wish. To me and to this family, you no longer exist." He turned away, making it clear the conversation was over. This was worse than being stoned to death. It was exile, complete oblivion. He wasn't just casting her out. He was erasing her from life itself. Rachel, her mother, finally tore her hands from her face. Her eyes were red and swollen. She came to Leah, grabbing her by the shoulders, her whisper as desperate as a prayer. "Leah, my child." "Why? How could you? We were preparing your wedding to Samuel, the carpenter's son. He is a good man." Leah remained silent, staring at the floor. What could she say? That she had been seduced by sweet words and promises? That she had been foolish and naive? It would change nothing. All night, she gathered her meager belongings into a small bundle. An old tunic, a boxwood comb her mother had given her for her 16th birthday, and the copper bracelet Nathan had left her. A useless, cheap trinket that now burned her skin. She moved through the house like a ghost, touching the familiar objects of her childhood. The clay jug she had learned to carry on her head, spilling water at first. The loom where she had spent so many hours beside her mother. Every object screamed of a life that was no longer hers. Just before dawn, as her father left for the synagogue for morning prayers, so he would not be seen near his sinner daughter, her mother came into her room. In her hands, she held a warm loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a small flask of water, and a few silver coins. "Take this, my child," she whispered, placing the bundle in Leah's hands. Her fingers were as cold as ice. "Go east, toward the Decapolis. The laws are different there, the people are different. Maybe God will have mercy on you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not weep. Her grief was too deep for tears. She hugged her daughter one last time, quickly, furtively, as if committing a crime. "Go," she whispered again, "and don't look back." Leah stepped out the door. The morning chill touched her face. The village was still asleep, shrouded in the gray pre-dawn mist. She walked down the familiar street, past the homes of neighbors who had smiled at her just yesterday but would cast a stone at her today. She felt like a leper, carrying her defilement through the sleeping land. She did not look back. She just walked, carrying a secret and shame in her womb, and in her heart, a gaping void where her home used to be. When the first rays of sun touched the hilltops, painting them a soft pink, the village was far behind her. Leah didn't dare turn back, but she felt its presence at her back, like a warm body that had suddenly grown cold and alien. Every step on the rocky path was an ache, not so much in her feet as in her soul. She walked east, aimlessly, simply because that road led away. The air was cool and clean, smelling of dust and wild herbs, but Leah could barely breathe. She walked on, consumed by her pain, as if enclosed in an invisible shroud. The memories of the previous night were like shards of glass in her mind. Her father's face, an impenetrable mask of righteousness, devoid of a single drop of compassion. Her mother's silent sobs, the sound of her powerlessness, which hurt more than any reproach. "You are dead to me." Joseph's words pulsed in her temples in time with her steps. He hadn't just cast her out. He had erased her, struck her from the book of their family's life. She had become Harim, something cursed, unclean, not to be touched. The sun climbed higher, and the morning coolness gave way to a growing heat. The shawl that had protected her from the cold wind now felt stifling. Leah slowed her pace, feeling a familiar wave of nausea. She sank onto a rock by the roadside, pressing a hand to her belly. There inside life stirred, a light, barely perceptible movement, like the flutter of a butterfly's wings. Before, it had filled her with a secret thrill and fear, but now something new was mixed in, a sharp, piercing guilt for this unborn being. She had condemned it to the same fate of an outcast. It would never have a family, a home, or a name. It would be the son of a harlot, an eternal reminder of her sin. The tears she had held back all night finally streamed from her eyes. They ran down her dusty cheeks, leaving dark tracks. She wept silently, her whole body shaking, alone on an empty road under the merciless Galilean sky. How long she sat there, Leah didn't know. The crying exhausted her, leaving only a ringing emptiness. She had to keep going. But where? Her thoughts raced in a panic. She could try to find Nathan, but where would she look? His caravan could be anywhere, in the Decapolis, in Samaria, or perhaps he had long since returned to his hometown, of which he had spoken so vaguely. And even if she found him, what would she say? Would he take her in? Or would he turn away with the same contempt as her father? The thought of fresh humiliation was unbearable. She got up and trudged on. The road became busier. A cart pulled by a donkey creaked past her. The portly merchant sitting in it gave her an indifferent glance and urged the donkey on. A family walked by, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The woman, noticing Leah, pulled her children closer and said something quietly to her husband. They quickened their pace, giving her a wide berth as if she were a leper. Their gazes, full of judgment and disgust, burned her worse than the sun's rays. She wrapped her shawl tighter, hiding her face. Now she understood. Her shame was written on her forehead. Every woman saw her as a threat, every man as prey. By noon, Her thirst became unbearable. The flask her mother had secretly tucked into her bundle was already nearly empty. Ahead, she saw a few date palms and cypresses, a sure sign of water. It was a small village, smaller than her own. Women were gathered at the well in the central square. They were laughing and talking as they filled their jugs. As Leah approached, their laughter died down. All eyes turned to her. A tense silence fell. "Peace be with you," Leah whispered, not daring to lift her eyes. "May I draw some water? I have traveled a long way." One of the women, an older one with harsh features, stepped forward. "Who are you? Whose daughter are you?" she asked in a commanding tone. I am Leah. I am going to Cana, to my relatives." She lied, and the lie burned her tongue. The woman eyed her from head to toe, her gaze lingering on her belly. A flash of contemptuous recognition lit up her eyes. "We know no such people, and in our village there is no place for wanderers," she said, stressing the last word in a way that left no doubt as to its meaning. "Go on your way. There is no water here for your kind." The women around her began to whisper, and in their whispers, Leah heard the words harlot, shame, humiliated, burning with shame. She turned and walked away without looking back. Behind her, she heard one of them spit in her direction. She had gone a fair distance from the village before her legs gave out. She fell into the dust by the road, gasping with despair. Would it be like this everywhere? Would the whole world now look at her with hatred and contempt? Even a sip of water was forbidden to her. She had not just been cast out of her home. She had been cast out of the world of men. The sun began to set. She needed to find shelter for the night. The surrounding hills were dotted with small caves and rock outcroppings where shepherds sometimes sheltered their flocks from bad weather. Leah found one such shallow cave, smelling of sheep droppings and damp earth. It was a wretched refuge, but it could protect her from the night's cold and wild animals. She ate the last piece of stale bread, washing it down with the remaining drops of warm water. Twilight fell, and with it came the cold. Leah huddled in the far corner of the cave, wrapping her arms around herself. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a jackal. The loneliness was almost tangible. It pressed down on her, robbing her of air. She remembered her warm bed, the smell of freshly baked bread in the morning, her mother's voice singing as she worked. All of it had been taken from her forever. She closed her eyes and tried to pray. The words, familiar since childhood, stuck in her throat. How could she turn to the God of her fathers, the God who had established the law that condemned her? It seemed he too had turned his back on her. His face was hidden behind an impenetrable veil, just like her father's. God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Her lips whispered silently, "Have you truly forsaken me? Is there no forgiveness? No hope for me?" The only answer was the cold, indifferent silence of the desert night. In that silence, Leah understood that she was utterly alone. And for the first time in her life, she was truly terrified. Waking was cruel, not to the crow of a rooster or a gentle touch from her mother, but to a cold that pierced to the bone and an aching pain throughout her body. Leah lay on the cold stone floor of the cave, and the first gray rays of dawn filtering in illuminated the squalor of her shelter. For a moment, in the hazy drowsiness between sleep and wakefulness, it seemed like a bad dream, but then reality crashed down on her with renewed force. The emptiness in her stomach, her parched throat, the weight in her belly, and an all-consuming loneliness. The world outside was waking up, but her world was dead. She crawled out of the cave, squinting in the light. Her legs were stiff and clumsy. She looked around. Hills covered in sparse shrubs and rocks stretched in every direction. Not a soul, not a wisp of smoke from a rooftop. Just her and the silent sky. Her thirst was tormenting, eclipsing even her hunger. Leah remembered the women at the well, their scornful looks, and knew she couldn't risk that again. She had to find water away from human eyes, like a wild animal. She walked down the slope, where the vegetation seemed thicker. An instinct she never knew she possessed guided her. After a while, She heard a faint gurgle. It was a small stream making its way through the rocks. The water was cool and clear. Leah knelt and drank directly from it, scooping water with her palms. She drank for a long time, greedily, until the pain in her throat subsided. Then she washed her face and hands, rinsing away the dust and tears of the previous day. This simple water felt like the greatest gift, and for a moment, she felt something like gratitude, though she didn't know whom to thank. The next few days blurred into an endless cycle of survival. She walked as long as her strength held out, trying to stay away from the main roads but not losing sight of them. She slept in crevices in the rocks or under the canopies of solitary trees. Her food consisted of wild figs she picked from thorny bushes, and sometimes roots she dug from the ground, remembering how as a child she had been taught to distinguish the edible from the poisonous. It was meager fare, but it kept her alive. Her body was changing. Her belly became more noticeable, and now she had to support her back as she walked to ease the nagging pain. The child inside her began to move more often. Its kicks were sometimes faint and timid, sometimes insistent and strong. Each movement was both a reproach and the only reminder that she was not entirely alone in this world. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would place a hand on her belly and whisper softly, "Forgive me, forgive me." She didn't know if she was speaking to the unborn child or to the God who seemed to have gone deaf. The world of people became hostile territory. She learned to be a shadow. If she saw travelers, she hid behind rocks. If she heard the creak of a cart, she would step off the path and wait in the bushes. Fear and shame became her constant companions. She no longer cried. Her tears had dried up, leaving behind only a scorched desert in her soul. She stopped thinking about Nathan. Memories of him brought a pain that was too sharp. She tried not to think of home either. The image of her mother's face, twisted with grief, was unbearable. She just walked, step by step, with no destination and no hope. At the end of the 4th day of her journey, the landscape began to change. The dry hills gave way to more fertile lands, with olive groves and vineyards appearing. There was a new smell in the air, fresh, salty, and damp. Leah realized she was approaching a large lake, the Kinneret, which the Greeks called the Sea of Galilee. The road led to a town spread out on its shore. It was Capernaum, a bustling fishing and trading town, a crossroads for many routes. The thought of entering the town filled her with panic. But she knew she couldn't wander the hills forever. Her strength was failing, and the cold and rains were coming. In a large town, amidst the hustle and bustle and the many unfamiliar faces, it was easier to get lost, to become invisible. Maybe there she could find some kind of work, the dirtiest, hardest work, to earn a piece of bread. She waited for dusk before entering the town. Capernaum was buzzing like a disturbed hive. The narrow streets were full of people. Fishermen with calloused hands were mending nets by their boats, pulled up on the shore. Merchants loudly called out to customers at their stalls, which smelled of spices, dried fish, and baked bread. Roman soldiers in gleaming armor strolled lazily along the waterfront, looking down on the dark-skinned locals. Children shrieked as they ran between the legs of passers-by. This whirlwind of life stunned Leah after days of complete solitude. She walked, pressing herself against the walls of the houses, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. Her tattered clothes, dusty face, and rounded figure, which her shawl could no longer hide, attracted curious and judgmental glances. She heard snippets of phrases, snickers behind her back. Every look was like the lash of a whip. She made her way to the pier. The smell of fish and rotting seaweed was particularly strong here. Old boats bobbed on the waves, creaking softly. Leah sank to the ground in the shadow of one of the boats, hiding from the scurrying crowd. Exhaustion fell upon her like a lead weight. Hunger cramped her stomach. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery was sweet torture. She closed her eyes, and in her mind's eye, she saw dinner in her former home. Her mother placing a bowl of steaming stew on the table, her father breaking bread. She swallowed a bitter saliva. Suddenly, someone stopped beside her. Leah fearfully ducked her head, expecting another insult. "Are you hungry, child?" The voice was old, female, a little scratchy, but without malice. Leah slowly raised her head. Before her stood a gray-haired woman, her face wrinkled like dry earth. She was the wife of one of the fishermen. Her hands smelled of fish and salt. She looked at Leah not with contempt, but with a kind of deep, ancient sorrow in her faded eyes. Leah couldn't utter a word, only nodded. The woman asked no more questions. She didn't ask who she was or where she was from, why she was alone and in such a state. She simply handed Leah a warm piece of barley flatbread wrapped in a cloth and a small dried fish. "Eat," she said quietly. "God is merciful." And before Leah could compose herself and thank her, the woman turned and slowly walked away, disappearing into the thickening twilight. Leah watched her go, then looked down at the food in her hands. It was simple food, the food of the poor, but for her it was a feast. She ate slowly, tearing off small pieces, and with each bite, a drop of warmth seeped into her parched soul. This wasn't just food. It was an act of mercy, the first in all this endless time. Someone had seen in her not a sinner, not a disgrace, but simply a hungry person. That night, curled up under the boat and listening to the lapping of the waves, Leah for the first time in many days did not feel cursed. She was still alone, still an outcast. But a tiny seed of hope, cast by the hand of a strange old woman, had fallen into her soul. Perhaps God was not as deaf as she had thought. Perhaps his mercy could be revealed not in thunder from the heavens, but in a quiet voice and a piece of bread offered in the darkness. Morning came with the noise of the waking town, the cries of merchants, the creak of carts, and the hubbub of fishermen on the shore tore Leah from a restless sleep. She had spent the night under a boat, and now her body ached from the cold and the uncomfortable position. But yesterday's piece of bread and the unexpected act of mercy had left a faint flame in her soul that fear could not extinguish. Yesterday, she had been a shadow, hiding from the world. Today, she had to force herself to become someone else, someone who wasn't just waiting to die. She had to find work. The thought seemed almost absurd. Who would hire a ragged, lone, pregnant girl? Her shame was her brand, visible to all. And yet, the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. She stood up, brushed off her only tunic, and taking a deep breath that smelled of fish and salt, she stepped out from her hiding place onto the sun-drenched streets of Capernaum. Her search began at the market. The air here was thick with the smells of spices, fresh manure, baked bread, and sweat. She approached the baker's stall, where a man flushed with heat, with flour on his eyebrows, was laying out rosy flatbreads on the counter. "Sir," she began timidly, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Do you need any help? I can sweep the floor, carry water. I'll do any work." The baker gave her a quick, appraising look, his eyes lingering on her belly, and his face immediately hardened. "I have sons to carry water, and there's nothing to sweep here but dust. Go on, don't block the merchandise," he snapped, turning to a customer. The rejection was like a slap in the face, but Leah forced herself to move on. She approached a cloth merchant who was arranging bright bolts of silk and coarse linen. Maybe he needed someone to sort wool or spin. He didn't even let her finish. Seeing her, he waved his hand in disgust, as if shooing away a pesky fly. She went through almost the entire market. The reaction was the same everywhere. Men looked at her either with contempt or with a greasy, predatory curiosity that frightened her even more. The women, however, saw in her a walking sin, a threat to their own well-being. They turned away, whispered behind her back, and some openly shook their heads, clucking their tongues in condemnation. With each refusal, her fragile resolve melted away. The city walls, which yesterday had seemed a possible refuge, now closed in around her, turning into a prison. The sun was already high when, exhausted and desperate, she wandered away from the noisy center into a labyrinth of narrower, dirtier streets. This was where the poor lived, and the air was thick with the smell of poverty. She was ready to give up, to find a dark corner and just wait for it all to end. But it was here, on the very outskirts, that she saw a small, low-slung inn. The sign, if there ever was one, had long since faded. It was a place for the poorest travelers. Mule drivers, hired laborers, fishermen from distant villages. At the entrance, kneeling on the packed earth, a woman with strong, sinewy arms was furiously scouring a large copper pot with sand. Her face was tired and sullen, a deep furrow etched into her forehead from constant strain. Leah froze. She knew this type of woman, their hearts hardened by hard work and perpetual need. To ask her for anything was pointless and dangerous, but her feet carried her forward on their own. She had nothing left to lose. She approached and stopped a few steps away, hesitant to speak. The woman didn't notice her at first. Finally, she looked up, and her dark, piercing eyes bored into Leah. There was no surprise or pity in them, only weariness and irritation at being disturbed. "What do you want?" she asked sharply. Leah's voice was barely audible. I'm looking for work, mistress. Any work. I'll wash floors, do laundry, clean. Whatever you say. For food and a place to sleep." The woman slowly straightened up, planting her hands on her hips. She looked Leah up and down, her torn clothes, her hollow cheeks, and, of course, her belly. A bitter smile touched her lips. "Another one. What makes you all think I'm running a shelter for lost sheep? My husband Jonah is a lazy good-for-nothing, and I've got so much work I'm about to drop. And you, look at you. In a couple of moons, you'll be twice the burden." Leah lowered her head, expecting to be told to get lost. Her heart clenched into an icy knot. But the woman was silent, as if weighing something in her mind. She saw the desperation in the girl's eyes, the same desperation she herself had known many years ago. To hire someone like this meant inviting gossip and possibly trouble. But to turn her away, something in the girl's silent dignity wouldn't let her do it. Finally, she made a decision. "My name is Tamar," she said in the same stern tone. "See that pile of dirty laundry over there? It's from the caravan drivers who left at dawn. If you can wash it all by sunset, so it's as clean as a baby's tear, you'll get a bowl of stew and can spend the night in the storeroom. We'll see about tomorrow. If you can't manage, you'll go on your way." It wasn't an act of mercy. It was a deal, harsh and simple. But for Leah, it was the whole world. "I can do it, mistress." "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time in many days, a note of strength sounded in her voice. The work was grueling. The laundry was soaked with sweat, road grime, and grease. Leah hauled water from the well, heated it over the fire, and scrubbed the coarse fabric on a washboard until the skin on her fingers burned. The lye ate into her sores, making her wince in pain. Her back was breaking, and the baby inside kicked so hard it seemed to be protesting this overwhelming load. But she worked with the persistence of the doomed. Every clean piece of cloth was a small victory over despair. Occasionally, she caught snippets of conversations from the patrons in the courtyard. They talked about taxes, the price of fish, the Romans, and several times, she heard a new name, spoken with different intonations. Some with hope, some with mockery, and some with fear. Jesus, a teacher from Nazareth. They said he healed the sick and cast out demons. They said he taught about the kingdom of God like no one before him. Leah heard these words, but they were just background noise to her, a distant hum. Her world had shrunk to a tub of dirty water and a mountain of laundry that had to be conquered by sunset. When the last rays of sun painted the sky crimson, she hung the last washed shirt. Her entire body was one continuous ache, but she had done it. Tamar came out into the courtyard. She silently inspected the work, meticulously examining several items. Her face remained impassive. Finally, she nodded one short, sharp nod. Without a word, she led Leah to the back of the house, to a small, dark storeroom that smelled of onions and dried herbs. In the corner lay a pile of old sacks. Then the mistress returned with a steaming clay bowl. It was lentil stew, thick and hot. Leah took it with trembling hands. "Eat," Tamar said, and left without waiting for a reply. Sitting in the darkness on the sacks, Leah ate slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her exhausted body. This was not just food. It was the right to life earned with her own hands. It was not like the charity of the old woman on the pier. This was something more. It was a foothold. She had a chance to live until tomorrow. And maybe the day after. Days turned into weeks. Leah's life fell into a new, harsh rhythm, dictated by the needs of the inn. She woke before dawn, lit the hearth, and carried water from the well while the other women of the town were just heading towards it. She swept the clay floors, cleaned the pots, washed endless piles of laundry, and helped Tamar prepare simple food for the guests. Lentil stew, barley flatbreads, baked fish. In the evening, when the last guests had gone to their rooms or fallen asleep on mats in the courtyard, she would collapse onto her sacks in the storeroom, too tired to think or feel. Tamar remained a stern and taciturn mistress. She rarely praised, but she didn't scold without reason. Her silence was a sign that Leah was managing. Sometimes, seeing Leah struggling to bend down to lift a heavy jug, Tamar would come over and take it without a word, carrying it herself. One day, she brought her an old but clean and mended tunic of coarse linen, wider than the one Leah was wearing. "It's not proper for the guests to be staring at your shame," she grumbled, but Leah caught something like sympathy in her eyes. Her husband, Jonah, was the complete opposite of his wife. Loud and lazy, he spent most of the day sitting in the shade and chatting with guests, leaving all the hard work to Tamar and Leah. He looked at Leah with a lazy curiosity but was afraid of his wife, so he didn't dare to touch her. Leah learned to be invisible around him, a shadow gliding about her duties. The inn was a crossroads of roads and rumors. Sitting at her work in a corner of the courtyard, Leah heard many stories. Merchants discussed the price of grain, Roman soldiers complained about the heat and boredom, and fishermen argued about the best time to cast their nets. And increasingly, in these conversations, the name of the teacher from Nazareth was mentioned. The rumors about him became more detailed and astonishing. One mule driver, his eyes wide with amazement, told how in a neighboring village, Jesus had healed a man possessed by an unclean spirit with just a word. An old fisherman swore he had seen him heal the mother-in-law of one of his disciples, Simon, from a high fever. The stories multiplied, embellished with incredible details. They said the Nazarene taught not like the scribes in the synagogues, but as one who had authority, that his words pierced the very heart. Leah listened, and in her soul, scorched by shame and despair, tiny, timid seeds of curiosity began to sprout. She, an unclean, fallen woman, dared not even think of approaching a holy man. People like him were for the righteous, for those whose lives were pleasing to God. Her life was an abomination, and yet, something in these stories wouldn't leave her alone. They said he didn't disdain to eat and drink with tax collectors, whom all the people despised. They said he showed mercy to those whom others condemned. One evening, a group of Pharisees on their way to Jerusalem stayed at the inn. They were important, pompous men in expensive robes, with tassels on their prayer shawls. They spoke loudly, confident in their own righteousness. Tamar and Leah served them dinner, trying to step as quietly as possible. "This Nazarene is a troublemaker," said one of them, with a gray beard and a stern face. "He violates the sanctity of the Sabbath. He allows his disciples to pluck heads of grain. He himself heals on the Sabbath, as if it were an ordinary day. And have you heard," chimed in another, younger one, "that he ate at the house of Levi the tax collector? And not just him, but all his disciples, with tax collectors and sinners." When they asked him about it, he answered, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." What blasphemy! He puts himself in the place of God, deciding who is sick and who is healthy. Leah froze in a dark corner, clutching an empty jug. The Pharisee's words pierced her. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. She was sick. Her soul was covered with an unhealing ulcer of sin and shame. The scribes and the righteous were for the healthy, but this teacher, maybe he was for people like her? The thought was so audacious and frightening that she immediately pushed it away. Who was she to even hope? But the words had already fallen into her soul, and she could not forget them. Weeks passed. Leah's belly grew larger, and doing heavy work became more and more difficult. Sometimes at night, She was tormented by cramps in her legs, and her back ached so much that she couldn't find a comfortable position on the hard sacks. The fear of childbirth began to supplant all other feelings. What would happen to her and the child? How would she give birth here in this dirty storeroom? Who would help her? Tamar was stern, but not cruel. Would she help her in her hour of need? Or would she cast her out, not wanting to deal with the uncleanness of childbirth? On one such day, when despair began to gather over her again, the servant boy from the synagogue leader's house ran into the inn's courtyard. His face was pale with fear. The teacher is here in the town," he shouted to someone on the street. "He is going to Jairus' house. His daughter is dying." Leah's heart skipped a beat. He was here, so close, maybe just a few streets away. The crowd in the courtyard began to buzz. People dropped their work, their conversations, and rushed in the direction the boy was pointing. Jonah, Tamar's husband, lazily rose from his place and followed the others to watch a miracle or the failure of another prophet. Leah stood rooted to the spot by the tub of unfinished laundry. Her hands were in soapy water, and her heart was pounding in her chest so loudly that it seemed everyone in the courtyard could hear it. This was a sign. This was her only chance. She didn't know what she wanted. To ask for healing for her sick soul? To ask for mercy for her unborn child? Or just to see him? To see the man who was not afraid of sinners? "What are you standing there for?" Tamar's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. She came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "The laundry won't wash itself." Leah turned around. There was such a plea in her eyes that Tamar's stern face softened for a moment. "Mistress," Leah began, her voice trembling. "May I go? Just for a little while. I'll come back and finish everything. I'll work all night." Tamar looked at her, then at her belly, then towards the street, from where the noise of the receding crowd could be heard. She sighed. "You're not much use right now anyway," she grumbled. "Go. But if this isn't all hanging up by evening, you'll have yourself to blame." Leah couldn't believe her ears. She stammered words of gratitude, hastily wiped her hands, and, without watching her step, rushed after the crowd. She ran as she had never run in her life, feeling neither the pain in her back nor the weight of her burden. She was driven not by thought, not by calculation, but by a desperate, all-consuming hope that the doctor for sick souls could heal her too. The streets of Capernaum had turned into a churning river. Leah, pushing through onlookers and squeezing between laden donkeys, hurried after the crowd. Every step sent a dull ache through her lower back. Her breath came in gasps, but she pushed forward, afraid of losing sight of the teacher. The crowd was dense, noisy, and excited. People jostled each other, craning their necks to catch even a glimpse of the man all of Galilee was talking about. Leah was too short and too weak to break through the wall of strong male backs. They pushed her, shushed her when she accidentally bumped into someone. "Where are you shoving, woman?" a fisherman threw over his shoulder, and in his voice, she heard the same familiar disdain. She was a nobody, a shadow on the sidelines of someone else's celebration of life. All she could see were the backs of heads, dusty headscarves, and occasionally, in a gap between shoulders, a group of people in the center walking more calmly. Jesus must be there. Despair began to return. How could she get to him? What would she say even if she did? "Master, I am a sinner. Have mercy on me?" They would immediately chase her away, perhaps even stone her for daring to defile a holy man with her presence. She slowed her pace, and the crowd immediately overtook her, leaving her behind. She stopped, leaning against the wall of a house, breathing heavily. This was probably a foolish idea. Tamar was probably right, and she should have stayed with her laundry tub. And at that moment, she saw another woman. She too was trying to push through the crowd, but her movements were different. Not insistent, but almost furtive. She was thin, pale, her eyes shone with a feverish light, and she was wrapped in her shawl as if afraid someone would recognize her. She moved along the wall, just like Leah, but her goal was clear. She wanted to get closer to the center of the crowd at any cost. There was so much desperation in her figure that Leah felt an involuntary kinship with her. Suddenly, the crowd stopped. Something had happened up ahead. People started buzzing, talking amongst themselves. Taking advantage of the pause, Leah managed to squeeze a little closer. She saw Jesus turn around. She couldn't see his face clearly, only his profile framed by dark hair, and his voice, calm but clearly audible even over the crowd's hum. "Who touched me?" he asked. His disciples, standing nearby, answered in surprise. "Teacher, the people are crowding and pressing against you, and you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he continued to look around, his gaze searching and serious. Leah saw the pale woman tremble all over and, stumbling, she emerged from the crowd and fell at his feet. "It was I, Master," she whispered so quietly that Leah could barely hear. I have been subject to bleeding for 12 years. I spent all I had on doctors, but I only got worse. I heard about you and said to myself, if I only touch the edge of his cloak, I will be healed." A murmur went through the crowd. "A woman with an issue of blood. Unclean. According to the law, everything she touched became unclean. She had no right to be among people, let alone touch the teacher." Leah froze, expecting angry shouts, condemnation. Now his disciples would drive her away, and the Pharisees, who were always lurking nearby, would have a new reason for accusation. But Jesus did not get angry. He bent down to the woman, and though Leah couldn't see his face, she saw his gesture. There was no disgust in it, no judgment. He looked at her, and the crowd around them fell silent, stunned by what was happening. And then he said the words that were forever etched into Leah's heart. "Daughter." He called her daughter. Not woman, not sinner, but daughter. "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Daughter, the word Leah had been deprived of. The word her father had erased from his life in relation to her. This teacher called an unclean, outcast woman who had broken the law his daughter. He didn't ask if she was worthy. He didn't demand repentance or a sacrifice from her. He saw her faith, her desperate, last hope, and he responded to it. Leah stood, shaken to the core. She forgot her pain, her fatigue, her own despair. She had witnessed something incredible. The mercy she had glimpsed in the eyes of the old fisherman's wife was now revealed in all its incomprehensible power. This Jesus didn't just heal bodies. He restored people's dignity. He called the lost daughters. The crowd moved again, carrying Jesus and his disciples toward Jairus' house. But Leah did not follow them. She no longer felt the need to push her way to him, to speak with him. What she had seen and heard was the answer, not to the question she had wanted to ask, but to the one that lay in the very depths of her soul. The answer was that there was hope, even for her. That faith, as tiny as a mustard seed, could touch the edge of holiness and receive not condemnation, but healing. She slowly trudged back to the inn. The noise of the city no longer seemed hostile to her. The humiliating glances of passers-by no longer hurt so much. Something had changed inside her. The wall of shame she had built around her heart had cracked. She was still Leah, the exiled daughter of Joseph, pregnant without a husband. But now she was also Leah, who had seen Jesus of Nazareth call a bleeding woman his daughter. And that changed everything. Returning to the courtyard, she silently got back to work. Tamar glanced at her sideways but said nothing, noticing the change in her face. Leah washed the laundry, but her thoughts were far away. Over and over, she replayed the scene in the crowd. "Daughter, your faith has saved you." She finished her work when it was already completely dark. Tamar, as promised, brought her a bowl of stew. "Well, did you see your miracle worker?" she asked with her usual sarcasm. Leah looked up at her. There wasn't a trace of her former fear in her eyes. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I saw him. That night, in her dark storeroom, she did not feel alone. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling her child kick. She did not know what awaited her. The fear of the future had not disappeared, but now it was mixed with a new, unfamiliar feeling. It was not just hope for survival. It was hope for forgiveness. Hope that even for someone like her, there was a place in the kingdom of the God whose Son calls the outcasts his children. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Leah fell into a peaceful sleep, without tears. The events of that day left a deep mark on Leah's soul. Outwardly, her life didn't change. The same grueling labor from dawn till dusk, the same cramped storeroom, the same taciturn company of Tamar. But inside, something had shifted. The heavy stone of shame and self-condemnation she carried in her chest became lighter. The image of the teacher, his voice, his astonishing mercy toward the outcast woman became her secret support. She often recalled the word he had called her, daughter, and it warmed her in the coldest and loneliest moments. Another moon passed. Autumn set in, bringing with it cool winds from the lake and rains that turned the dusty streets into a muddy mess. Leah's belly grew so large and heavy that even the simplest work became a trial. It was hard for her to bend down, to carry water, to stand for long periods. Tamar, noticing this, grumbled even more than usual, but her grumbling had changed. There were notes of concern in it. She increasingly made Leah sit down, giving her the lightest work, sorting lentils, peeling vegetables, while taking the heaviest tasks upon herself as before. One evening, as a heavy rain drummed on the roof and there were no guests at the inn, they sat together in the kitchen by the hearth. Tamar was mending an old fishing net, a job usually done by Jonah, but he had gone to play dice with friends. Leah was silently sorting dried herbs. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the sound of the rain. "Soon," Tamar said suddenly, without looking up from the net. Leah started, understanding what she meant. "Yes, mistress. Are you afraid?" The question was unexpected. Tamar never asked about her feelings. Leah hesitated with her answer. "I'm afraid," she finally confessed in a whisper. She was afraid not so much of the pain, but of what would come after. What would she do with a baby in her arms, alone, without a penny and without a name? Tamar paused her work for a moment and looked at her with her tired, perceptive eyes. "Everyone is afraid the first time," she said with surprising softness. I had a son. He died of a fever when he was 2. God gave me no more children." She said it in a flat, almost indifferent tone, but Leah saw her lips tremble. For the first time, she saw in this stern woman not just a mistress, but a person with her own old, deep-seated pain. "I'm so sorry, mistress," Leah whispered sincerely. Tamar waved her hand, as if shooing away unwanted memories. "It was a long time ago." She went back to her net. "When your time comes, I will help you. I have some herbs, and my hands remember what to do. You will not be alone." Leah looked at her, unable to utter a word. Tears welled up in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, they were tears of gratitude. A few days later, news spread through the town again. The teacher from Nazareth had returned. This time, he was not hurrying to anyone's house. He was teaching the people right on the shore of the lake, not far from the town. People flocked to him from all the surrounding areas. The inn was abuzz with talk about him. Leah was seized by a strong, but this time calm, desire to go and listen to him. Not to chase a miracle, not to try to push her way to him, but just to be where he spoke and to hear his voice. On the Sabbath, when there was less work, she gathered her courage and approached Tamar. "Mistress, may I?" she began. Tamar, without waiting for her to finish, nodded. "Go. Just wear a warmer cloak. The wind from the lake is cold. And don't stay out until dark." The shore was crowded with people. They sat on rocks, on the sand, on the hillside, forming a living amphitheater. Leah, just like last time, found a spot at the very edge, at a distance, leaning her back against an old fishing boat. From here she could see him well. He stood at the water's edge, and his voice, amplified by the surface of the water, carried far. He spoke of the kingdom of heaven. His words were simple yet so profound that they pierced the very heart. He spoke not like the scribes, quoting the law and the prophets, but as one who had seen what he was talking about. And he spoke for people like her. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Leah heard, and her heart clenched. She was poor. She had nothing left. No honor, no family, no hope. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. She had mourned so much that her tears seemed to have scorched her soul. Could comfort await her? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. She thirsted, not for food and drink, but for truth, justice, and mercy in this cruel world. And then the teacher said the words that seemed to be addressed directly to her. Across the whole crowd, across the distance, through the wall of her shame. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Burdened. The word resonated in every cell of her tired body, in her aching back, in the weight of her belly. She was burdened, and he was calling her, not chasing her away, not condemning her, but calling her, promising rest. When the sermon ended and people began to disperse, Leah remained seated, unable to move. The teacher's words still echoed in her ears, filling her soul with a quiet light. She didn't notice him after saying goodbye to his disciples, walking along the shore in her direction, alone. Leah saw him only when he was very close. Panic seized her. She wanted to jump up and run away, to hide, to disappear. She bowed her head, wrapped her cloak tighter, trying to hide her belly, her shame. But he stopped right in front of her. Leah squeezed her eyes shut, expecting him to pass by. But he did not. "Peace be with you," he said. The voice was the same one that had addressed the crowd, but now it was quiet and personal. Leah dared not raise her eyes. She only gave a slight nod. "Why are you sitting here alone when everyone has gone? What troubles your heart, daughter?" He called her by that word again. Daughter. It sounded so simple and natural, as if he were her father, the father she had lost. The sound broke through the last of the armor around her soul, and, unable to hold back any longer, she began to weep silently. She couldn't utter a word. Only her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. She asked for nothing, complained of nothing. All her shame, her loneliness, her fear poured out in those silent tears. Jesus waited until the first wave of grief subsided. He didn't rush her, didn't offer comforting platitudes. He just stood beside her, his presence calm and reassuring. Finally, he said quietly, "Your Father in heaven knows about every bird that falls to the ground. Do you really think he doesn't know about your pain? You are more valuable than many sparrows. Your life is precious in his eyes." Leah slowly raised her tear-stained eyes to him. In his gaze, she saw no condemnation, no pity that she so hated. She saw understanding. He looked at her as if he saw right through her, all her sin, all her fear, and still called her precious. "But I am disgraced," she whispered, and that was all she could manage. Disgrace in the eyes of men is not always disgrace in the eyes of God, the Nazarene replied gently. He does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Rise, go in peace and do not be afraid. The life you carry within you is also a gift. Not a curse, but a gift. He held out his hand to her. Hesitantly, Leah placed her trembling palm in his. His hand was warm and strong, like a carpenter's. He helped her to her feet. For one brief moment, their eyes met, and in his, she saw such love and such all-encompassing forgiveness that it took her breath away. "Do not be afraid," he repeated once more, and releasing her hand, he continued along the shore. Leah remained standing alone, watching him go. The wind from the lake whipped her cloak and dried the tears on her cheeks. But these were different tears now. The heavy burden that had crushed her all these months was gone. Her problems hadn't vanished. She was still homeless and alone, and childbirth was ahead. But her inner death had vanished. Her father's words, "You are dead to me," had been erased by the teacher's words, "Your life is precious." She placed both hands on her belly. Not a curse, but a gift. For the first time, she thought of her child not as a sign of her shame, but as a life that was precious in the eyes of God. She turned and slowly walked back to the town. She walked not with her head bowed, as before, but straight. She was no longer a shadow. She was Leah, a daughter whose life was considered precious. And that was enough. The peace found on the lakeshore stayed with Leah. It wasn't loud or showy. It was a quiet, deep assurance that had settled in her heart. She stopped fearing people's stares. She no longer felt unclean. The teacher's words became her anchor in the storm of daily worries. Returning to the inn, she met Tamar, who gave her a long, searching look. "Your face is different," she grumbled. "Not like a beaten dog's. So, does your Nazarene really perform miracles?" "He just spoke with me," Leah answered quietly, and she added, looking directly into the stern woman's eyes. "He said my life is precious." Tamar snorted, but something like surprise flickered in her eyes. She said nothing more and went back to her chores. But from that day on, her attitude toward Leah subtly changed. There was less grumbling and more silent care. The final weeks of waiting passed in this new tranquility. Leah worked as much as she could, and when her strength failed her, she sat in a corner of the courtyard, mending clothes or simply watching the bustling guests, praying silently. Her prayers had also changed. Before, they were desperate, incoherent cries to a deaf sky. Now, they were a quiet conversation with the one who knew the value of sparrows and considered her life precious. She no longer asked to be saved from her fate. She asked for the strength to accept it. The time came suddenly, in the middle of the night. At first, it was a dull, aching pain in her lower back, similar to what she felt after a long day of washing. But the pain didn't go away. It grew sharper, coming in waves like a storm on the Kinneret. Leah, lying on her sacks in the dark, bit the edge of her cloak to keep from screaming. She knew it had begun. The fear she thought she had conquered slithered like an icy serpent into her heart. It was one thing to believe in the value of her life, and quite another to pass through the gates of pain that could become the gates of death. She endured as long as she could, but when the waves of pain became so intense that her vision blurred, she knew she couldn't do it alone. Gathering her last strength, she crawled out of the storeroom and, clinging to the wall, made her way to Tamar's room. She knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately. Tamar stood on the threshold with an oil lamp in her hand, already dressed, as if she had been waiting. Her face was serious and focused. "Has it started?" she asked curtly. Leah could only nod, doubling over from a new contraction. "Follow me. Jonah is sleeping like the dead. Thank God. Men are only a hindrance in this business." She led Leah not to her storeroom, but to the kitchen. It was warm from the dying hearth. Tamar quickly rekindled the fire and placed a pot of water on it. She spread old but clean blankets on the floor. Her movements were swift, confident, without fuss. She acted like a warrior preparing for battle. "Breathe, girl," she said in a commanding but calm voice. "Don't waste your strength screaming. Breathe deep when the pain comes. That's it." The night turned into an endless, hazy nightmare, woven from pain and brief respites. Leah lost track of time. The world shrank to the small kitchen, the dancing shadows from the lamp on the walls, and Tamar's face leaning over her. This stern woman, who had seemed so alien to her, became her only support. She wiped her sweaty forehead with a cool cloth, gave her a warm herbal broth that slightly eased the spasms, and talked to her. Not comforting, but commanding, forcing her to fight. "Come on, child, a little more. You're strong. Stronger than you think. For him, come on." In the darkest hours, when it seemed the pain would tear her apart, Leah remembered the teacher's words. "Do not be afraid. Come to me, all you who are burdened." She clung to these words like a drowning person to a piece of wood. She prayed to him, silently, asking not for relief from the pain, but for the strength to endure it. And as dawn broke, painting the small kitchen window gray, after one particularly long and agonizing contraction, a cry was heard. But it wasn't her cry. It was the thin, demanding cry of a new life. For a moment, everything fell silent. The pain receded, leaving behind a ringing emptiness and an incredible lightness. Leah lay exhausted, breathing heavily, unable to believe it was over. "A boy," Tamar said. There was weariness in her voice and tenderness. "You have a son, healthy, loud, a real man." A few minutes later, washed and wrapped in clean rags, he lay on her chest. Leah looked at him, and her whole world turned upside down. She looked at his tiny, wrinkled face, the dark hair stuck to his forehead, the fingers clenched into fists. And she was flooded with such a wave of love, such an all-consuming tenderness, that she gasped. There was not a shadow of shame in this little being. There was only a miracle, a gift, just as the teacher had said. She touched his cheek with her fingertip. He was so real, so warm, her son. Tears flowed down her cheeks again, but they were tears not of grief, but of awe. All her shame, all her humiliation, all her loneliness. It was all washed away by that first cry, that first touch. Tamar quietly cleaned up the kitchen, then sat down beside her, bringing Leah a cup of warm milk with honey. "You did well," she said, and it was the highest praise Leah had ever heard from her. "What will you name him?" Leah didn't hesitate for a moment. The name came to her on its own, born of her suffering and newfound hope. "Matania," she whispered, not taking her eyes off her son. Tamar raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Matania, gift of God? A bold name." "He is a gift," Leah said firmly. "He is my gift from God." She held her son close, inhaling his milky scent. She was no longer alone. She was Leah, the mother of Matania, and her life, which had seemed over on the day her father cast her out, was actually just beginning. Here, in the dirty kitchen of a wretched inn, in the arms of a stern woman who had lost her own child, the exiled daughter of Joseph found a new life, a new name, and a new family. The first days of motherhood were a fog for Leah, woven from exhaustion, pain, and an boundless, almost frightening love. Her world shrank to the size of a small, warm bundle that grunted, cried, and greedily sought her breast. She barely slept, mixing up day and night. Her former life, full of hard physical labor, now seemed like an easy stroll compared to this all-consuming service to a new person. Tamar freed her from all work, taking on all duties herself. She cooked nutritious broth for Leah, made sure she rested, and taught her the intricacies of handling a newborn. "Don't be afraid, hold him tighter," she would grumble, showing her how to swaddle Matania properly. "He's not made of clay, he won't break. See how he likes it tight? Makes him feel secure, like in your womb." For Tamar, little Matania became the center of the universe. The pain of losing her own son, which she had carried for years under a shell of severity, found an unexpected outlet. She could sit for hours by the cradle, which Jonah had cobbled together from an old box, just watching the sleeping infant. Sometimes Leah would see her secretly wipe away a tear. In those moments, a silent bond formed between the two women, stronger than blood ties. Jonah, to Leah's surprise, was also charmed. His feigned laziness and indifference vanished whenever he saw Matania. He would approach the cradle, extend his huge, calloused finger, and the baby would immediately grip it with his tiny hands. "Look at that Tamar," he would boom with delight. "A strong man, just like me. He'll be a fisherman, a real man." Tamar would just snort, but a twinkle danced in her eyes. The child's presence had softened even her perpetually dissatisfied husband. The inn, that noisy, ever-changing world, reacted to the baby's arrival in various ways. Most of the patrons, simple fishermen, merchants, cattle drivers, regarded him with simple, artless affection. The women, fishermen's wives, would peek into the kitchen, bringing Leah a handful of dates or a piece of cheese, offering unsolicited but kind-hearted advice. But there were others. One day, a scribe from Jerusalem, a man with a haughty face and cold eyes, stayed at the inn. He noticed Leah nursing Matania in a corner of the kitchen, and his lips twisted in a grimace of disgust. "What is this?" he asked loudly, addressing Jonah but looking at Leah. Is your house a refuge for harlots and their illegitimate offspring? This is an abomination before the Lord. According to the law, she should have been stoned. A dead silence fell in the kitchen. Leah went cold, instinctively clutching her son tighter. Her whole newfound world, all her confidence, crumbled to dust in an instant. She was once again what she had always been, a sinner worthy of death. But before she could shrink away and hide, Tamar stepped forward. She stood between the scribe and Leah, her hands on her hips. Her face was like a thundercloud. "The law, you say?" she snarled, and her voice had the ring of steel. "Perhaps you'll tell me about the law, learned man? Perhaps you'll remind me what the law says about mercy for the widow and the orphan. This girl is an orphan because her father disowned her. And this infant is an orphan too, because he has no father. And they are both under my roof. And if you have a problem with the law that commands me to give them shelter, you can go and sleep in the rain. God be your judge." The scribe turned purple with rage. He opened his mouth to retort, but meeting Tamar's furious gaze and seeing several sturdy fishermen at the table slowly rising from their seats, he clamped his mouth shut. He silently turned and, throwing a few copper coins on the table, stormed out of the inn to the sound of contemptuous laughter. That night, when all was quiet, Leah went to Tamar. "Thank you, mistress." Tamar waved it off. "It's nothing. I don't like those righteous types whose hearts are drier than last year's figs. I saw how he looked at you." She paused, then added more quietly, "No one will harm you or your boy. Not while I'm alive." Months passed. Matania grew. He had already learned to smile, and his toothless grin, directed at Leah, was more precious to her than all the treasures in the world. He cooed and reached for the simple toys Jonah carved for him. Leah gradually returned to her work, but now everything was different. She worked not just for her own food and shelter, but for her son's future. She no longer went to listen to the teacher. Rumors about him reached her constantly. He would leave for other towns, then return to Capernaum. His fame grew, but so did the hatred for him from the scribes and elders. Leah kept his image and his words in her heart. They were her secret strength. Every night, as she rocked Matania to sleep, she would quietly tell him about her meeting on the shore. "One day, my boy," she would whisper, "I will tell you about him for real, about the man who said you are a gift, not a curse." One spring day, when Matania was almost 6 months old and sleeping peacefully in his cradle in the courtyard, a traveler entered the inn's gates. He was a merchant, his clothes covered in the dust of distant roads. He asked for water and food. When Leah brought him a jug and a flatbread, he looked up at her, and her heart stopped. She recognized that smile. It wasn't as warm as in her memories, more tired and uncertain. But it was him, Nathan. For a moment the world lost all sound. The noise of the courtyard, the cries of merchants from the street, even the buzzing of flies over the water jug. It all disappeared. All that remained were two faces, frozen opposite each other. Leah looked at Nathan, and a storm rose in her soul, sweeping away the peace she had so long and painfully acquired. Anger at his betrayal, the pain of months of waiting, the bitterness of the humiliation she had endured. All of it mixed with the ghost of the naive love she had once felt for him. She was no longer the girl he had left. That girl had died in the dust of the road, at the well where she was denied water, in the cold cave. In her place stood a woman, hardened by suffering, a mother. Nathan looked at her too, and his face mirrored the same shock. He had changed. The dust of the road was ingrained in the wrinkles around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His shoulders, which had seemed so strong to her, drooped under the weight of his travel bag. His gaze lacked its former self-assurance, containing only endless fatigue and something else, something like fear. "Leah," he whispered, and the very sound of her name from his lips felt like a blow. I couldn't believe I'd find you. I went to your village. Your father said you had left. He didn't say where. I've been looking for you everywhere." The water jug trembled in her hands. She managed to set it on the table. Her voice, when she finally found it, was cold and distant. "You're too late, Nathan. Autumn has long passed." His face contorted in pain. "I know. Forgive me. I couldn't come back. When I was on my way back in the autumn, our caravan. We were attacked by robbers in a gorge. I was wounded, I lost everything, the goods, the money. I barely survived. I couldn't go to your father as a beggar with empty hands. I was a coward. I was ashamed. I went to the Decapolis, worked as a camel driver, saved every coin so I could return with honor." His words, which might have moved her a year ago, now sounded like weak excuses. Honor? What did he know of honor, when hers had been trampled in the mud? While he was saving coins, she was fighting for a sip of water. While he was ashamed of his poverty, she was burning with shame. "Your honor was of little concern to me when I was sleeping in caves and eating roots," she said in a flat voice, devoid of tears. "Or when I was chased from wells like a leper." Nathan bowed his head, unable to meet her gaze. He looked broken. "I know there's no forgiveness for me. I didn't come to ask for it. I came to just find out what happened to you. And if you'll let me, to fix what can still be fixed." At that moment, a discontented cry came from the cradle in the shade of the olive tree. Matania had woken up and was demanding attention. Leah flinched as if waking up. Nathan looked up in surprise, his gaze shifting towards the sound of the cry. His eyes darted from the cradle to Leah, to her figure, which no longer showed signs of pregnancy but had acquired a new, motherly bearing. His eyes widened with a dawning realization. "Leah," he began in a choked whisper. Is that a child?" Before Leah could answer, Tamar came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She gave Nathan a heavy, foreboding look. "And who might you be, traveler?" she asked authoritatively. "You come, you sit, and you stare at a woman as if she's your property." Nathan jumped up, looking flustered from Tamar to Leah. I am Nathan. I knew Leah. Before. Before is a good word," Tamar snapped. "Before, she wasn't thrown out of her home. Before, she didn't have to wash other people's dirty laundry for a bowl of stew. Before, she didn't have to give birth alone on a kitchen floor." Every word from Tamar was like the crack of a whip. Nathan turned pale. He looked at the cradle again, and now his gaze held not just a guess, but a terrifying certainty. "Is he mine?" he forced out, looking at Leah. Leah stood up straight. She wasn't going to hide anything. Her son was not a shameful secret. He was a gift. "Yes," she said firmly. "He is your son. His name is Matania." Nathan staggered as if he had been struck. He leaned on the table to keep from falling. He stared at the cradle, his eyes a mixture of horror, remorse, and awe. "My son," he repeated, like an echo. He took an uncertain step toward the cradle, but Tamar blocked his path. "Not so fast, merchant," she hissed. "You have no right to him. You abandoned her. You left her to die. This boy survived because of her and the grace of God, not you. So turn around and go on your way, before my fishermen explain to you what we do in Capernaum to those who harm our women." Nathan wasn't looking at Tamar. He was looking only at Leah, and tears stood in his eyes. "Leah, I'm begging you," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to take me back. I know I don't deserve it, but let me at least look at him. Let me help you. I have some money. I can rent a room for you, buy food. I will work here in the town, just to know that my son lacks for nothing." Leah was silent, torn. One part of her, the part that remembered the pain and humiliation, wanted to scream at him to get out and never come back. But another part, the one that had heard the teacher's words about forgiveness, looked at this broken man and saw not just a betrayer, but a repentant sinner. And most importantly, she looked at the cradle. Her son had a father, a living one, and he wanted to be his father. Did she have the right to deny Matania that? She raised her hand, stopping Tamar, who was ready to push Nathan out the gates. "Wait, Tamar." She turned her gaze to Nathan. There was no longer love or hate in her eyes, only a calm, sad clarity. You can't buy forgiveness, Nathan, and you can't undo what's been done with money. What was between us is dead. She paused, letting the words sink in. But he is your son, and I will not take his father from him. You can stay. You can see him. You can help him if you wish. But know this, you will have to earn my trust. For a long time, perhaps for the rest of your life. She nodded toward the cradle. Tamar, pursing her lips in displeasure, stepped aside. Nathan, stumbling as if in a dream, walked to the cradle. He knelt and looked inside. Matania had just woken up and was looking at the world with big, dark, curious eyes, just like Nathan's. The spice merchant, who had seen distant lands and dangerous roads, reached out a trembling hand and touched his son's tiny palm. And at that moment he wept, silently, bitterly, as men weep when they realize the full weight of their mistakes. Leah watched this scene, and her heart felt neither gloating nor triumph, only a deep, endless sadness and a tiny, barely perceptible sprout of hope. The path to healing would be long and difficult, but perhaps it had just begun. Leah's words hung in the heavy air of the courtyard. You will have to earn my trust. For Nathan, this was both a sentence and a gift. He had not received forgiveness, but a chance. And he clung to it with the desperation of a drowning man. He didn't argue, didn't make excuses. He silently nodded, wiped his tears with the back of his hand, and, rising from his knees, looked at Tamar. Mistress, he said in a voice that held no trace of his former merchant's swagger, only humility. Do you have any work? The hardest kind. I'll carry water, clean the stables, do whatever is needed. For food and the right to stay here. Tamar gave him a contemptuous look, but something in his tone made her hesitate. She glanced at Jonah, who was watching the scene with curiosity from the shade. Jonah shrugged. An extra pair of hands wouldn't hurt, he drawled lazily, especially if they're working for food. Tamar pursed her lips but didn't argue. Fine, she snapped at Nathan. The donkey stalls won't clean themselves. We'll see how long your enthusiasm lasts. Thus began a new, strange life in the small inn. Nathan became a shadow, a ghost from Leah's past who had suddenly taken on flesh. He rented a tiny room in the farthest part of town and came to the inn at dawn, leaving after dark. He did the dirtiest and hardest work, the kind that even day laborers refused. He cleaned the animal pen, hauled heavy sacks of grain, mended the dilapidated fence. His hands, accustomed to handling silk and spices, became covered in calluses and scrapes. He lost weight. His face became weathered, resembling that of the simple fisherman. He hardly spoke, especially to Leah. He addressed her only when absolutely necessary, and always called her by her name, quietly and respectfully, as if afraid to cross the invisible boundaries she had set. All his devotion was given to Matania. Every day, before starting his work, he would go to the cradle and just look at his sleeping son. When the boy grew older and began to sit up, Nathan carved him wooden animal figures. Clumsy, rough, but made with such love that Leah couldn't help but acknowledge it. In the evening, after finishing his work, he would go to his son again. If Matania was awake, Leah, her heart heavy, would let him take the boy in his arms. Nathan held him awkwardly, with fear and reverence, and would whisper something quietly to him. In those moments, his face would transform, showing the same warm expression that had once captured the heart of a young girl from a Galilean village. Leah watched him, and her heart was a battlefield. Her reason and memory screamed that she couldn't trust this man, that he had betrayed her once before. But her eyes saw something else. They saw his humility, his patience, his boundless, silent love for his son. He never once complained, never tried to evoke pity or guilt in her. He simply accepted his lot and, day by day, with his labor and devotion, tried to atone for the past. Tamar remained his harshest judge. She watched his every move, and her rare comments to him were as sharp as a knife. Think you've cleaned the manure, and now your soul is clean? She would snap as he passed. Nathan never answered. He would just lower his head and walk on. But one day, Leah saw Tamar, thinking no one was watching, place an extra piece of bread in the bowl Nathan took with him for dinner. Almost a year had passed since his return. Matania was already starting to walk, holding onto walls and furniture. He was a cheerful, healthy boy, the light of life for all the inn's inhabitants. He reached out his hands with equal joy to his mother, to Grandma Tamar, and to Grandpa Jonah, and to Nathan. He didn't know the story of his birth. For him, this quiet, sad man with kind eyes was just a part of his world, someone who was always there. The turning point came during a hot summer. A fever swept through the town. The disease struck down both old and young. One night, Matania woke up crying. He was hot as an oven. His breathing became rapid and wheezy. An icy terror seized Leah. Tamar rushed in with herbs and decoctions. She sponged the boy with cool water, gave him a bitter drink, but the fever wouldn't break. The two women spent the entire night by the cradle, listening to the child's every breath. At dawn, Nathan entered the kitchen. Seeing Leah's pale face and hearing his son's raspy breathing, he understood everything without a word. His face turned gray. He didn't interfere, didn't offer advice. He just sat on the floor in a far corner, his head in his hands, becoming a living embodiment of fear and helplessness. For 2 days and 2 nights, they fought for Matania's life. The fever would recede, then return with new force. The boy weakened, stopped eating, only moaned pitifully in his sleep. Leah never left his side. She forgot about sleep and food. She prayed as she had never prayed before. She prayed not to the God of the law, but to the one who had met her on the shore. She didn't demand a miracle. She simply pleaded, "Lord, if you consider his life a gift, do not take it away. Not from me, please." At the end of the second day, when it seemed all hope was lost, news came to the town. The teacher and his disciples were nearby, in a village at the foot of the hill. They were resting there after a long journey. Nathan, hearing this, raised his head. A desperate resolve gleamed in his eyes. He jumped to his feet. "I will go to him," he said hoarsely. Tamar looked at him doubtfully. "You? Who are you for him to listen to you? You can't even get through the crowd of supplicants." "I won't try to get through," Nathan replied. "I will lie in the dust by the road until he notices me. I will beg him. I will do anything." He looked at Leah. "Let me," he pleaded. "Let me do something. For him." Leah looked at her son, small and helpless, fighting for every breath. And she saw in Nathan's eyes the same pain, the same love that was tearing her own heart apart. At that moment, he was not a betrayer, not a stranger. He was her child's father, and their grief was one and the same. She nodded. Nathan bolted from the place and ran out of the town as if demons were chasing him. Leah remained with Tamar by the cradle, continuing her mournful vigil. The hours dragged on like an eternity. The sun began to set. Matania's fever did not break. Leah had almost lost all hope. She bent over her son, pressed her cheek to his hot forehead, and wept, preparing for the worst. And suddenly, she felt the fever under her cheek begin to subside. At first, barely noticeably, then more and more. The boy's breathing became steadier, deeper. The wheezing stopped. He stopped tossing and fell into a calm, deep sleep. Leah and Tamar exchanged glances, not believing their eyes. Tamar touched his forehead with her rough hand. "The fever is breaking," she whispered in awe. "Praise the Almighty. The fever is breaking." They sat in silence, afraid to move, afraid to scare away this fragile miracle. An hour later, Matania woke up. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. He saw his mother and smiled faintly. And then he whispered his first clear word, "Amma, Mama." At that moment, Nathan appeared in the doorway. He was covered in dust, his clothes were torn, and his knees were scraped. He could barely stand from exhaustion. He saw Matania sitting in Leah's arms, looking at him with clear eyes. He saw the miracle. He listened. Nathan breathed out, slumping onto the threshold. I couldn't get close to him, but I shouted. I shouted that my son was dying in Capernaum. His disciples tried to chase me away, but he stopped. He looked in my direction and just said, "Go, your son is well." And I believed. I believed him and came back. Leah looked at Nathan, at this man who had run for miles, lain in the dust, and believed the word of a strange teacher. And she knew she could no longer carry the anger and resentment in her heart. The mercy she had received freely on the lakeshore demanded mercy from her in return. She stood up and, holding their shared, saved son in her arms, went to Nathan. She knelt beside him on the floor and, for the first time in that long, agonizing year, touched his hand. "Thank you, Nathan," she said quietly. In that simple touch and those two words, there was more forgiveness and acceptance than in 1,000 speeches. Nathan raised his tear-filled eyes to her, and they reflected not only gratitude but also the birth of a new man, a man who had known both the depths of his fall and the heights of God's mercy. The miracle of Matania's healing became the invisible mortar that bonded the cracked stones of their lives. The wall between Leah and Nathan didn't crumble in an instant, but a door appeared in it. They began to talk, at first about Matania, his first steps, the funny sounds he made, and then gradually and very cautiously about themselves. They didn't talk about the past. It was too painful, a wound not yet healed. They talked about the present, about the small joys of each day. Nathan was no longer just a worker at the inn. He became part of their strange patchwork family. Jonah, seeing how hard he worked, began to trust him with some of his tasks and even taught him how to mend fishing nets. Tamar grumbled less and less, and one evening, as they were all having dinner together, she placed a bowl with the best piece of fish in front of Nathan. No one said anything, but everyone understood the significance of the gesture. Leah saw how Nathan was changing. He was no longer the carefree merchant who had seduced her with tales of distant lands. He had become a quiet, serious man whose faith, born of desperation on a dusty road, was now as real and solid as the stones of Capernaum. Sometimes in the evenings, when Matania was asleep, they would sit in the courtyard and listen as other patrons, fishermen who had become disciples of the teacher, quietly retold his words and parables. In these stories, they both found answers to questions they dared not ask each other. One day, when Matania was 2 years old, an old olive oil merchant who often traveled throughout Galilee came to the inn. Seeing Leah, he squinted, and then his face lit up. "Child, is that you, Joseph's daughter? I remember you as a little girl. Thank God you're alive. In your village, they thought you had perished." Leah's heart tightened at the mention of home. "What have you heard, sir?" she asked quietly. "There is sorrow there, child, sorrow," the old man sighed. "Your mother, Rachel, may the Lord rest her soul, faded away a year after you left. Her heart couldn't bear the separation. And your father, he's become like a shadow. He walks around, looking at no one. His righteousness has become a heavy stone around his own neck. They say he often sits by the road that leads east, just staring into the distance." Leah listened, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She wept for her mother, whose last, stolen caress she remembered so vividly. And she wept for her father, not with hatred, but with pity. She pictured him, a broken old man sitting by the road, and realized she had long since forgiven him. Her resentment had been washed away by the teacher's mercy, just as dirt is washed away by clean water. That evening, she told Nathan everything. He listened silently, his face full of sympathy. "What will you do?" he asked when she had finished. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I can't go back there. Not now. My home is here now." Nathan was silent for a moment, then looked at her with determination. "Leah, I know I have no right to ask. I know my word isn't worth much, but I want our son to have a real home, and a real family. Let me go to the elders and declare you my wife. Let me give Matania my name. I can't give you back what you lost, but I swear before the God we have both come to know that I will devote the rest of my life to ensuring that you and he never know sorrow or need again." He wasn't on his knees, not speaking beautiful words of love. He spoke like a man taking an oath. And Leah looking into his serious, devoted eyes, saw in him not a shadow of the past, but the promise of a future. She remembered the teacher's words, "Do not be afraid. Your life is precious." Her life was precious, and she was worthy of being a wife again and building her own home. "Yes," she said quietly, "I will." Their wedding was nothing like the ones she had dreamed of as a child. There was no noisy feast, no hundreds of guests. They simply went to the elder in Capernaum. Jonah and Tamar were their witnesses. Tamar put her only festive shawl on Leah, and Jonah gave Nathan a few silver coins for the marriage gift. When the elder pronounced the words of blessing, Tamar secretly wiped away a tear. They did not stay at the inn. With the money Nathan had saved and earned, they rented a small house with a little courtyard near the shore. Nathan, using his old connections, opened a small shop where he sold spices and incense. Leah kept the house. Their life was simple, not wealthy, but full of quiet dignity. One evening, the three of them sat on the doorstep of their home. Matania, laughing, chased fireflies. Nathan was mending a sandal, and Leah watched the stars light up over the dark surface of the Kinneret. The air was filled with the scent of salt, blooming oleanders, and peace. "Are you thinking about them?" Nathan asked quietly, guessing her thoughts. Leah nodded. "I pray that God gives my father peace," she said. "Maybe one day we can go there, not to ask for forgiveness, but to give it." Nathan covered her hand with his. "We'll go when you're ready." She looked at her family, at her husband, whose face was marked by both the mistakes of the past and a newfound faith, at her son, whose name meant gift of God, and whose life was a testament to a miracle. She remembered herself, a broken, exiled girl, dying of shame on a dusty road, and she understood that her story was not about shame. It was about grace, about how, even from the deepest pits of despair, one can come out into the light, about how a life that the world considers cursed can be precious in the eyes of God. Matania ran to her and buried his head in her lap. She hugged him, breathed in the smell of his hair, and looked at her husband. In his gaze, she saw the reflection of her own happiness. She was home. At last she was home.